preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y for the first evening of our series, The Human Mind. This series was developed in order to provide a context in which to probe theoretical and practical models of the brain and how it functions, the neurological construction of reality, the evolutionary origins of the mind, and finally, the relationship of brain, mind, and soul. Each of the 4 speakers who are participating in this series will lecture on a particular focused topic, thereby helping to clarify some of these complex and fascinating issues for us. The House rules state that no photos may be taken nor any tape recording done during the course of the evening, and I ask that you comply with this request. The format tonight will be as follows. Dr. Restak will present an initial lecture and slide presentation, during the course of which you may write any questions you wish to pose on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. In about 45 minutes, ushers will collect the cards and bring them backstage for presentation. Our guest this evening is Dr. Richard Martin Restak, who has braved the snow and cold in Washington, D.C. to be with us. From 1973, Dr. Restak has had a private practice of neurology and is the director of the Adult Neurobehavioral Center and the Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., where he also holds the position of clinical assistant professor. Dr. Restak is the author of many books, including the 1986 Doubleday publication, The Infant Mind, 1984's The Brain, as well as The Self-Seekers, The Brain, The Last Frontier, Explorations of the Human Mind and Our Future, and Premeditated Man, Bioethics and the Control of Future Human Life. Dr. Restak has edited many professional anthologies and has contributed to numerous magazines, journals, and newspapers, including Semiotica, The Wilson Quarterly, Science Digest, Psychology Today, The Saturday Review, Newsday, The Washington Post, and the New York Times Book Review. We're honored that he is here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Richard Martin Restak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Can we just lower these lights a little bit so I can see everyone because I know they can see me, and we should equal and make it fair and all. First of all, public service announcement. Anybody that's even remotely considering going to Washington the next day or so, I recommend very strongly that you don't do it. At least wait a couple of days. It's knee-deep in snow down there. We're not used to snow, being a southern city. And also, we can't manage it, as JFK said, city of northern charm and southern efficiency. But at any rate, I'm happy to have made it up here. The hardest part was getting from my house to the airport. A speaker who is part of a series of talks is both lucky and unlucky if he's the first or she is the first speaker, because you have the opportunity to get a fresh audience that is enthusiastic and interested. I also think you have the obligation to set some groundwork that other speakers can depend upon building and can assume has been presented. So I'm going to do a little of that tonight. I'm going to do it painlessly, I hope, but there's going to be some presentations of some very important things about the brain, because we're really here to talk about the most important 3.5-pound process, because it is a process as well as a thing in the known universe. And I'm going to give you just a little overview of what I'd like to talk about and a few points. When one wants to understand the brain, do we look at it in its totality, or do we look at it from the point of view of the single cell? Is it possible to understand something that is very vast, complex, and has many components by exploring a specific example or individuated unit? Now, I could understand quite a bit about New York City or any other city by talking to a resident or someone who lives in the city. And we could really learn a lot about how it works and how it was built and so forth. So it's possible to do that. But on the other hand, the city is built of the many components. So we're going to talk about a couple of dialectics, because we're really talking about dialectics. and several dialectics tonight. One is the individual neuron or brain cell versus the whole brain. And this is the holistic or versus the localization model of it. There's also the point of, is the brain completely the tabula rasa, the complete blank slate, or does it in fact have certain predispositions? Does the brain imply certain things about its organization, which we can then assume and use when we talk about mind? Because in Western thought, we like to think of ourselves as totally free, and totally free means non-constrained. And one of the difficult things has always been the idea that there may be biological constraints. Of course, this comes back to Cartesianism and Descartes. And we're going to talk, therefore, in the first part of the talk, I'd like to give you an historical survey of how it is that we're here tonight talking about the brain. Because if we were in Egypt, or with the Sumerians, or in Israel, the psalmist talked about the liver. My liver shall sing praise to you and not be silent. So that in various cultures and various times, there were views about what was the important component by which we would understand mind. Now, Plato came to the conclusion that mind was associated with brain. And he came about it from the view that the senses could not be trusted. And to be able to understand something, it was necessary to use the rationality. And he came to the idea that the brain was the important component, the important element in mind, by his thinking about geometry and the sphere. The sphere is the perfect object. Therefore, which part of the body comes closest to that perfect geometric figure, and therefore the head with the enclosed brain. He was helped a little bit, of course, with Hippocrates, with his findings and his observations that sword wounds to the head would cause changes in movement or lack of movement on the opposite side of the body, and changes in personality. Now, Aristotle, who came later, went about things using the scientific method, but unfortunately he was wrong. He was using the right method, but he came to the wrong conclusion. He said the heart was the important component, because when a person dies, the blood cools, and he thought that the brain was really simply a cooling mechanism for the blood that was pumped by the heart. Of course, this is now in our language. We talk about bleeding hearts and things like this. We hear that phrase occasionally used, which implies that the emotional part, that part having to do with feeling and sensation and empathy, is located in the heart. And of course, Valentine's Day coming up, we don't send people cards with brains on it. We send them cards with hearts, and we have the Cupid firing the heart, hitting the heart, not the brain. So we still have these intermixes, and of course, we can talk a little bit about language tonight, because the way we talk about brain and mind is heavily embedded in the language we use. So-and-so had a mental breakdown, or we can talk about someone who cracked up. These are mechanical models which we can trace back in history to the age of the steam engine. Now, what I'd like to talk a little bit about initially would be the Greeks. And of course, there were two ideas there that part of the important elements in brain and mind had to do with things that were flowing within the body. Now, if you think about the brain as a solid structure, but it's not very solid in terms of, if you hold it in your hand, it's about the size of, or the consistency of an avocado, and soon after death, it begins to dissolve into a liquid state, becomes like a jello initially, and then goes into like a yogurt, and then becomes like one of these new yogurts that shake up, see? So it's sort of like, becomes more and more liquefied. The one thing that remains, however, are the ventricles, or the openings in there. You can make your own little model of the brain, incidentally. Paul MacLean told me about this, just closing your fists, putting them together like this. And it's a good way to kind of remember that here's the corpus callosum that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, here's the frontal lobes, and then, of course, the inside that you cannot totally close corresponds roughly to the ventricular system. So therefore, the big debate was, what's the most important part? Was it this outer substance, or was it the ventricle? Well, it seems obvious to us that it has to be the substance, because we think of the brain as a thing. So therefore, a thing is a substance. Whereas the ancients, since they did not have preservatives, it wasn't until 1785 that there were actually decent preservatives. However, in the 1630s, there was a man that we're going to talk about later, who's known to everyone here who has any interest in architecture, who actually designed a method of demonstrating the brain by injecting wine up into the arteries and showing it. And he worked with Thomas Willis, the most famous book of the brain in the 16th century. I'm going to see who can guess what his name was later. Now, the Galen in the 2nd century was totally convinced that these ventricles were important, so he therefore said, well, you had to have knowledge and you had to have reasoning and memory. And these were the compartments: sensation, reason, and memory. Now, Leonardo da Vinci in 1470 then began to try to demonstrate in the human brain which was the more important, the ventricles or the substance. Now, we must remember that at that time, it was not considered legitimate to do dissections. And of course, we know that he did do human dissections, but those things that he printed and drew were ox brains, and also there was one of the human, and I'll show you the slide in a moment, which has this idea of compartments. Now, let's start off with some slides and show you how some of this comes together. If we could have the first slide, please. If you can't hear or there's any problem like that, please feel free to speak up. Now, do I push the button or there we go. Now, the idea that there's something floating around within the body, whether it's in the blood or whether it's within the ventricular system of the brain, of course, is very popular, and we know now when we talk about neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about further. But the ancients had the idea, of course, that the vital spirit initially started in the intestine, was then taken up into the heart, went up into the brain at what was called a ret mirabile, or wonderful net, from which we had vital spirits, which then went out into the body through canals. Now, therefore, we had terms: the bilious individual. This is the bile being drained. Incidentally, this is not a laser pointer, so no one has to fear for their eyesight if it tends to. This, of course, is the sanguine lover who is serenading his lover there. This is the phlegmatic, the phlegm. So there was this phlegm that was going through the body, which was associated with disinterest. Of course, then this is the cholera, the angry individual. So there were personality types that were associated with certain substances flowing through the body. Now, a little bit later, we'll see that the phrenologists became interested in the idea that maybe there were personality types associated with particular configurations in the brain. Now, this is Leonardo da Vinci's drawing, which we said before, and you can see the 3 different compartments. He then went, and you might wonder, well, how would you be able to demonstrate these particular ventricles? This looks like the banana here. It looks like this is the ventricular system. He did it by filling it with wax. And of course, that was part of his genius, to be able to take something that would be difficult to do. So the wax went in and formed, and then when he cut the brain, he could demonstrate this ventricular system. Now we go up into the Vesalius, who in 1543 started to collect human specimens. At that time, he was doing this without the fears of being handed over to church authorities and so forth. And the way he did it was to go to executions and collect the heads as they went into the basket. I gave this little instruction at a university, and someone said to me, one of the ones in the front seat said, well, if he got more of them, was it then the talking heads? I said, no, just... At any rate, you could see the verisimilitude of this to a modern view of perfect anatomical symmetry. And this, of course, was in 1543. I want to show you a picture done by a Paracelsian mystic. Now, this gets us into the idea of what do these ventricles, what is the conduits that they're associated with. Now, I'll step away from the mic occasionally. If I don't talk loud enough, just tell me. These are the ventricles, having again to do with knowledge and memory and reasoning. And of course, here's the sense that comes in. You see vision, odor through the nose, taste, and it comes up into these ventricular systems, which are actually in communication with there's God and the angels, so that there was this idea that there was this flow of vital energy that went throughout the universe, that which a person could become into contact with through the perception, through the senses. But as we said earlier, Platonic idea that the senses were not to be trusted. Now, this brings us, of course, to Descartes and a Cartesianism. In 1664, when he talked about in his Treatise of Man, we have to remember that what was really the stimulus and the inspiration to him were the royal gardens. The French royal gardens, in which the characters moved, in which they came to life because of hydraulics. And this gave him the basic idea, of course, that the body was separate from the person. And that was his own idea of the cogito ergo sum. And of course, this also ties in with the Platonic idea, because the person is able to absent themselves from the body and sort of look out at it and as an object. Now, we'll see this again in the 19th century and even into the 20th when we talk about the homunculus, the inner individual that surveys everything and is independent of the brain. And I think that we will, by the end of our talk, perhaps be able to discuss the fact that when one talks about mind separate from brain, that we're really talking more in terms of a theology than we are anything that would agree with the science. So dualism with Descartes, he stated that language and consciousness is what separated the man, the human, the woman, from machines. Now, I think you can jump up to about the 19th century when we get to Francis Gall. Now, Gall had the first of the localization theories, that there was something about individuals who had very prominent eyes. He noted that they seemed to be quite intelligent, that they were very quick. And that gave him the idea that perhaps there was some way of telling about an individual's personality by palpating the skull. This is an early print of feeling with the calibers the particular bumps on the scalp. And of course, we now know that there's 3 thick coverings before we get to the brain, so that there's really not a lot to be said about the brain underneath of a person by palpating their skull. And you can see the manservant there sort of has an intuitive idea that this is somewhat nonsensical. These are some of the ideas: love and amativeness and gustatory abilities. This is some of the consciousness. There's even republicanism there somewhere. Actually, there's republicanism on there somewhere. I guess they didn't mean it quite the way that we do, but at any rate, you apparently could feel somebody's scalp and tell whether they believed republicanism. And of course, after a dinner party, this was the thing. And it was quite a good way to meet people. Certainly the degree of intimacy that you might like. And if the living didn't interest you, then of course we had the opportunity to bring your own skull. And it must have been quite fascinating. This brings us, of course, to 1848. And in April of 1848, September 13th, in Cavendish, Vermont, an event happened. 1848, as you know, was the year of Das Kapital, so it was a revolutionary time. This was a revolution in our ideas about the human brain. About 4:30 on that day, Phineas Gage, who was a foreman of the railroad, the Rutland and Burlington Railroad, was tamping an iron 3.5 feet long, 1.5 inches in diameter, and 13 pounds. And there was an explosion because there was some dynamite there that was ignited as he put this down into the hole. It then shot up underneath this orbit and come through the frontal lobes and hit this. He had an immediate convulsion. He was put into a buckboard, driven into the town. The doctor was called, and he was treated with what at the time was the utmost in terms of medical treatment: calomel, rhubarb, and castor oil. Surprisingly, he did improve, and as we know, and those that saw the Brain series, he improved physically, but he was left with lacuna, we might call them, in the superego, as the analysts would describe it. He became an unreliable person. He became a person who was hedonic and was not able to delay satisfaction. He could not man the crew. He could not be involved anymore with dependable things. He had a very sad end. He traveled with a circus for a while. He was taming some wild horses in South America. There's a picture of him, a painting of him, actually in Boston, where he was visiting the neurologist that was following him. So what we knew from that was that mind, responsibility, personality, and compassion were actually associated with a brain region. Now, try to imagine the revolutionary input of this. It really meant that these spiritual, if you would, qualities of compassion and understanding, responsibility, that they actually had a locus within the brain, so that when damage was done there, the individual lost these capacities. Now, within a short time, we know about Broca and we know about Wernicke, who discovered that there were parts of the left hemisphere that had to do with language. And if a person had a lesion here, they had Broca's aphasia. And this, of course, is the man Tan-Tan, who's described and called Tan-Tan because these were the only words that he could say. Apparently, doctors and medical students and such back in those days had the same sort of ironic humor they do now, so they gave him this name. He goes down in the medical literature as Tan-Tan. Wernicke's patients, however, were those that had a very different kind of language disturbance, which I won't take time to go into. But the point is that once again, we get to this localization thing. So we're getting this dialectics now headed towards the concept that the human brain can be localized. The phrenologist Gall said, feel people's scalp and we can tell whether or not they're a Republican or whatever he was interested in. Well, we recognize that as nonsense, but then we move on to the idea that parts of the brain are associated with language, or in the effect of Phineas Gage, associated with ethicality and things. So we're really moving into the idea of, gee, let's sort of slice it up and find out what's involved and what's involved with what. Now, I'd like to make a little side remark here, because when you go out on a winter morning like I did in Washington and can't get my car started, I mean, you don't jump to the conclusion that the problem is necessarily in the ignition. It could be the battery. It could be you're out of gas. It could be that something is frozen. So you cannot imply localization of problems when localization of function simply from problems. And that's something that's often forgotten. And the whole idea that we've built up about the brain, of course, came from the dissection laboratory, where we found out that somebody like Tan-Tan had this difficulty speaking, and somebody then cut their brain up and said, hey, there's the spot for language. Well, it's a little bit like going into the automobile thing and saying the problem is in the ignition because I couldn't start the car. You cannot necessarily imply function from deficit, and that's something that we want to keep in mind. Now, this is simply the connections between the two language areas. Now, one of my particular interests that I want to tell you about, my research interest, is in brain transplants. And I'm going to tell you, I do the research not in laboratories, but in the newspapers. And every once in a while, we're going to see a little comment on brain transplant. This is the first one. It says, that was a good one. Try it, Hobbs. Just poke his brain right where my finger is, and then this is what happened. One of the things about the brain, of course, getting back to the localization versus holistic view, is that with the invention of the microscope by Leeuwenhoek, he was able to show that, in fact, this brain, this homogeneous structure, is composed of many, many small cells. And then in 1875, Emilio Golgi found that it's possible to stain these cells, to actually put something there that will make them take on a color. Now, this is one neuron, an axon here, and many dendrites. Now, we never know why certain ones stain and others don't, but they either stain or they don't. So therefore, whenever you look at one of these, you can actually pick out the neurons, and you see the trees that exist here. At the same time that Golgi discovered this stain, one of the most interesting people in the history of the brain, Ramon y Cajal, who was an artist, a Spanish artist, a man who's known to the people of Spain as a hero. I mean, you can talk to students who can't tell you exactly what he did, or in some cases what he was, but he's a man of great intellect and great power, and they have great veneration for him. And one of the reasons is that he looked at the brain with this stain, and he said, well, you know, these cells are separate. And Golgi said, no, they're not separate. I mean, look at it, it's like the trees where all the branches are interconnecting. Well, they shared the Nobel Prize in 1906. It's sort of an interesting situation when you get two people who have diametrically opposed ideas sharing the Nobel Prize. Golgi said that the thing was a net, sort of like a spider web, everything connected to everything else. And Cajal said, no, each one of these neurons is specific. They're tablecloths that exist, incidentally. He used to go to a cafe across the medical school, and maybe we would paint and draw on the tablecloths, and some of them still exist, showing what he saw on the microscope at night when he was looking. These are just various colors that you can do. You can use various kinds of aniline. Now, I said earlier that the first person who showed that the brain could actually be preserved was a man who worked with Thomas Willis in the 1640 when he did the brain book. This man discovered by the use of putting alcohol in that you could harden the brain so it could be cut. He lost interest in neurology and the brain, and lost interest in science and medicine in general, and went into architecture and became probably the most famous architect of the 17th century and 18th century, and I'm sure you all know who I'm talking about, Christopher Wren. His particular genius was so astounding to read about him and the things that he could do. He gave up medicine entirely when he was in his 30s, and he went into architecture. At any rate, that's an aside about the business of staining the brain. Now, I want to give you a little quick tour through the brain. This is the outer surface of it, and this is the touch. You know, if you're in the operating room, we get into something very, very gelatinous, but we talk about the half-ripe avocado. Now, let's focus this, because this will enable us to go through the whole anatomy business in a few minutes that took me several years to get through. This is the brain cut this way and then turn. So it'll be like cut this way and then I turn. And the big structure is, of course, the cerebral cortex, which gets larger and larger as we get into primates and into humans. And the corpus callosum connects the two particular hemispheres, as I talked about in the first model. The thalamus is the area that is the intermediary between the periphery and going up into the cerebral cortex. Now, the emotional area of the brain, which we'll talk a bit about, it's so-called limbic system. This is down here. We have the olfactory bulb and into the amygdala and into the hippocampus and then this fornix and then around forward. So what you've got, of course, is an indication that there's some relationship and interpenetration between olfaction and emotion. Of course, anybody that is involved in perfume, people that are involved in creation of new scents and things like this knows about that. Also Proustian idea. Proust actually was not talking so much about the taste of the Madeleine as he was the aroma of it through the olfaction. I suspect that if Proust had a cold, that the remembrance of things past may not have actually been written. So it's a matter of olfaction, not so much taste. We go down here into the pons, which is the bridge between the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that we see in the ballerina. So we go to watch the prima donna ballerina. This is the tremendous involvement and tremendous development of the cerebellum. The medulla is down here where breathing and heart rate and things like this are controlled. Then we get to the spinal cord. Now, I've got a couple of real nice pictures which I drew on the way up in the airplane that I want to show you. This is from one of the National Geographic books that I contributed to, so I didn't figure there'd be any harm if I took a couple of pictures from it. Imagine yourself pushing a button, and then we're going to talk about the message going up. I think this is a little out of focus, at least it is to me. Is it out of focus? Yeah, if you could just focus that up a little bit. Here's the skin as you push the button, and you sort of stimulate these Meissner corpuscles, which go out into it's still, could you just focus a little bit more so we can read these, and then people don't have to take my word for the names. I mean, is that it? Okay, all right, well, the axon, we get the nerve signal. It comes louder. Okay. I might as well just use this. I don't have to move around, do I? Okay. We have the axon with the message coming along here. That's the signal, I should say. Now, Lord Adrian found, of course, that the signal does not change according to the intensity. That when something becomes more intense, you don't get a higher signal, you get frequency changes. So this was a very important finding about the brain. So here we go along into the spinal ganglia. It goes into the spinal cord and then up along here, up to the thalamus. Now, the next picture, each one of these is going to be one of these high-tech things where we sort of come in and explode and increase the magnitude of the next picture. So here we are. This is a picture of where we were before, going up at the thalamus. Now we're going to move up into the sensory cortex right here. And this is what we see. This is the tremendous intermingling of the various types of cells. Now by the communication between these cells, we begin to get the first feeling that we've touched something, and that's what the pressing of the button is about. Now we're going to come in. Yeah, this really, can you focus that a little bit better? Right in here and enlarge that part. And this is what's happening, of course. The axon becomes, electrical signal is changed into a chemical signal. So at the synaptic cleft, we have these vesicles, which are the neurotransmitters. So if you think back to that early slide where we saw the man beating the woman and the other one playing the guitar and the lute, this is the correlate of the view that there's something circulating around. It's not circulating in the blood. It's a chemical that is being released at the cleft between the two neurons. And of course, this is one of the reasons that Golgi and Cajal had the difference of opinion, because the very small synaptic junction can be missed, and it looks like two cells. So let's look at this area right here. You're going to love this next picture. you go on, and this is what we're looking at. There's actually dissolving of these membranes, and in come the vesicles, the neurotransmitters, which then affect the sodium and potassium, which then alter their position. So we're seeing shifts in these ions. So the potassium, which is in the cell, comes out, and the sodium, which is outside, comes in, and that's the beginning of the action potential. That's what is going on. Now, we're moving towards the view that there aren't just one sodium channel, one potassium channel, also calcium channel, but there are many. So it is quite possible that each of the neurons has its own basic signature, or put differently, that each neuron in the human brain is conceivably unique because of the combination of membrane structures along here between sodium, potassium, calcium, and other elements. Now, of course, if we're not awake, I have to take a look at it. Everybody is. If we're not awake, then the brain isn't working. And this is the reticular formation. And this is what sends the signals up into the brain. So the reticular formation is about the size of your little thumbnail. So the whole business is dependent on this tiny area. So it doesn't matter, what the cortex is doing if that area has an infarct or a destruction. And of course, if you remember back to unfortunate Karen Quinlan, that's where her problem was. It's another picture of the same thing. Now, the brain, of course, is organized functionally because Wilson is going to talk more about the biology of this, but we're functional organisms. It's more important that my little finger can oppose to my thumb. It's more important that my lips and tongue can move rapidly enough to say the words that I want to say and use the phonemes and separate consonants and vowels and all this. This is important, more important than the middle of my back, for instance, being able to scratch it. So there's the brain is organized that way. The most important parts are lips, tongue, face, tips of the fingers, and so forth. And you get down to gums, teeth. And then if you really want to look at things like, arm, and look how small the representation of that is. So the hand and fingers are large in the representation of the brain and small here, whereas our arm is bigger than our finger, so it's functional. We have to remember that this is the way the brain is organized. And of course, also with the increase in the cerebral hemispheres as one goes from these various organisms. Also within the human, we get increase the cerebral hemisphere with infolding. Now, why does it look like that? Well, if you think about the fact that those of you that might have a cold, you bring a handkerchief with you. You don't bring it inside of a frame that you carry along with you. You wrinkle it up and put it in your pocket. Well, this is what's happening here. You can increase the surface area without increasing the volume because it becomes convoluted. That's why it looks like a walnut. That's why you have this walnut structure. So these convolutions are the little gray cells, as Poirot would say. This is just increased. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the development. It's just other pictures. These are some of our cousins. Why do we have more time? We're more interested in the chimpanzee than the man, for instance, even though there's quite a similarity here. The reason is that the chimpanzee does not mind being stared at, does not accept this as a hostile act, whereas other primates do. That's why we were then able to talk about language. That's why we became interested in the language possibilities of the chimp, because we could establish enough eye-to-eye contact with them. In other primates, lower primates, eye-to-eye contact is a hostile act. You also see that in children. They are very small. It also has a lot of things that we don't have time to go into, but during the Atlanta child molestation thing several years ago, there was a thing that was put out that I saw telling parents not to let their children look into the eyes of strangers. So there was this recognition that the gaze of an adult would be such that no matter what you told a child about not talking to strangers, if the eye contact was made, the things would take place along unfortunate lines. Now this is my next one on the brain transplant. The operation was a success. Later the duck, with his new human brain, went on to become the leader of a great flock. Irwin, however, was ostracized by his friends and family and eventually just ambled south. I want you to remember that one because you'll see it gets even more profound as we move on. This is my book on the infant mind and brain. I just want to point out two things, and this is the other dialectic about something that's inborn versus something that's learned, the tabula rasa versus the idea of inherent capabilities. This is the tongue. The baby within a couple days will stick out its tongue to the mother. So this obviously is an example of a reflex that is not learned. It also can be overinterpreted when we begin to use our own linguistic language abilities and say, well, the baby must know that that's a tongue, and says, well, Mommy put the tongue out, and I put the tongue out. And of course, we know that's nonsense. It's an imitative act. And there are, of course, animals that are strictly imitative. One of my interests is parrots. I have a parrot, and they don't speak because they have a vocal cord situation like our own. They're imitative animals. So they not only imitate language, they imitate movement. In fact, I'm told that a woman with Parkinson's disease has a parrot who has a tremor. I'd like to see that. This, of course, is the visual cliff experiment, which we know about, but the new element of it that I want to talk to you about in terms of the emotional part of the brain has to do with what happens when the baby is here. This is about 10 months to a year, and sees this, won't go across because it looks down and sees this drop, and yet the hands touch the side and feels secure. Well, Bob MD at Denver has shown that if the mother is standing over here and she's projecting a certain type of emotion in her voice, she can be saying, come, but if she's been trained to say it in an angry voice, come, the baby will hesitate. So if whatever particular emotion is expressed, the baby will pick up the emotion where it doesn't understand the words. So we have here this dichotomy between emotionality and rationality, if you will, which is present very early. This is more of a high-tech picture of it, the baby coming over. So I'm struck with the fact that there's this inherent tendency to fear, but it also can be manipulated, if that's the right word, by pretensions on the part of the mother. So the baby picks up emotions. Now this little slide has to do with an experiment I call the Halloween experiment. That's actually a little girl up there. It's a little boy. You cross-dress them, and what you find is that adults will be fooled. You can give them to young women or young men, and they will treat them as that one will be treated as a little girl. But the children themselves are not fooled, and they will look preferentially at a child of their own sex. And if you put lights on the major joints like the elbow and the wrist and on the forehead and knees and ankles, and then turn on these little lights and let them move around in the dark, they can even do it in the dark. So what does that tell us? It tells us there's a motor program, a motor engram, if you will. And I think this is probably what Reich was talking about when he was talking about character analysis. How many times do we recognize people at a distance, the way they walk? You see somebody a block away and you wonder, how do I know it was them? Because there's a motor signature that's as individual as the fingerprint. And it starts very early in life. It's nothing that's learned. So that how does these children, are they able to do this? Now, I want to go into the area of what I think will be the most important things in the next 20 years in terms of differentiating and helping us to discern mind and brain. Are they different? Are they the same? And we're going to talk about the technologies that's come about, because really we're kind of prisoners of the technology that we have. All the things that we've learned about the brain had to do with how we were able to isolate it. Soon as we were able to open it up at surgery, people like Penfield were then able to go in and stimulate it and get experiential illusions and things like that, which I think you'll hear about later. Another talk, personality changes that have to do with temporal lobe manipulation electrically. So we move on to all these things that have to do with technology. Now, the latest technology, of course, CAT scans, MRI, and PET scans. And I want to go into how we can use these methods to help us to understand the brain and, I think, by inference, the mind. Most pictures of the brain are not very useful because different parts interfere with each other. Of course, if you've got an object, there's a person going into a CAT scan. If you've got these sensors picking up the X-rays from various positions and then calibrating them and transforming them into pictures, you can get a structural three-dimensional, or not three-dimensional, but you can get a picture of the brain. And of course, that's structure. And we have to differentiate structure from function. And of course, function is what makes something worthwhile. What's important about this evening? Is it that we're sitting here on chairs and I'm standing here at a lectern holding something? No, these are things. You could talk about the structure of the room, but they're really not interesting. What's important is the function, what's going on. So these tests, such as the evoked potentials, you can hook up a person, that's an electrode list, and they're sitting looking at something as simple as looking at a checkerboard, which may alternate, and these colors may change. Going into that eye will stimulate the occipital lobe, and you'll be able to tell things like, is the optic nerve working, which will be right behind the eye, goes all the way up into the primary optic cortex. Now, of course, these things support our view, don't they, of localization. This is the kind of pictures that you can get, a person looking, and then you can get the actual electroencephalographic changes or brain waves. Now, the problem with CAT scans, of course, is that they do have radiation. Now, if you have an MRI, it's possible, and it's a very simple principle, that the hydrogen ion in water can be aligned, and if a person's put into a unit such as this, and a radio frequency unit is then set off, it will tend to misalign the hydrogen ions. And they will then come back into alignment, and then that movement which is brought will enable you to get a picture of that person. Now here's a picture of the face. You recognize the forehead, eyes, eyeballs, and this is because these are the parts of the face that are mostly water. So they don't pick up bones so much. So this is what an MRI would look like. Now, of course, this is the kind of pictures that you really get. See, this is the cerebellum, and you get to the point where you don't have to even guess anymore about what the anatomy is. And here's a tumor down into the spinal cord. So this is a person who came in with a problem with their gait, and on the MRI you have a tumor. The next study is the PET scan. This is based on the fact that the most active part of the brain is the one that uses the most metabolites. As we know, the brain is a physical organism. If I'm here lifting weights, these muscles will be the most used. The same thing, whatever I may be doing, what part of my brain is being used will be the part that will use the most oxygen and most glucose. So what's happened is cyclotron is used to create a positive positron, which is then injected, goes up into the brain and meets with a negative, with an electron, and they go off into opposite 180-degree angles. And of course, these sensors then are able to catch this and calibrate them with a computer, and you begin to get pictures such as this. Now you're really getting very, very close to actual pictures of what the brain looks like. So if you do a study of a cadaver cutting the brain, it doesn't look like much different than this. But the most exciting thing is it's a living process. You're looking at something that's actually taking place at the moment. Now this is digital subtraction angiogram. We can skip that for the minute. You can spot tumors. Here's a tumor inside the brain that you can do through this particular beam. It's a little boy with a problem in walking, and when had a PET scan done, the red and orange, this is normal. See all this blue? That's because there's a brain tumor there that was removed. Now, the part that's the most interesting, though, is the things that it tells us about the normal brain and what you can learn about it. Here's a person going into a PET scan. He has these on his ears so that you include sound. Something will be put over his eyes to include vision. Here he is, eyes open, ears open. And you can see this is the visual area. This is the auditory area. The eyes are open here. The ears are closed. You see the difference between this and this? You see the difference how it's gotten decreased? So there's less being used because the ears are closed. Here the eyes are closed and ears are open. So you just about lose your visual, but this is, and here's when the eyes close and eyes and ears close, and you've just got this little residual back here, which apparently has to do with the fact that even when we have our eyes closed as tightly as we can, we still can see phosphenes. Here's somebody listening to some music, and this is where we learn about function, where we learn about something like a music appreciation center. But when we try to figure out what part of the brain has to do with music or listening or talking, we get into something that I think is going to surprise many of you. This is an auditory stimulation test. The resting state. Person is sitting there, eyes closed. They then hear some language. They're talking or listening to language. And look, the left hemisphere, just like in Broca and Wernicke, it's the left hemisphere that has to do with it. Here's music. If they're listening to music, it's the right hemisphere, sort of language or music appreciation center. Here they've got language and music. So it kind of supports the idea, doesn't it? Well, everything's localized. But watch what happens. Here's something. Person is eyes closed, not much happening. This is to visual stimulation. The eyes are open and you can see the visual area. And this is what's called a complex scene. Now the complex scene was, here's the person sitting in a dark room with their eyes closed. The next, they're looking at a white light or looking at a white background. And third, they took them out on the campus of UCLA on a Saturday afternoon. Now, anybody that's ever been on the campus of UCLA on a Saturday afternoon knows that that's a fairly complex scene. And this is equivalent of almost an epileptic seizure with the white hot in the optic area. Now here's the one I wanted to tell you about in terms of localization, and this throws the idea of localization off quite a bit. We'll take our time with it because it's a little bit complex. Here's the control person. We move down here to the person talking or listening, and we've got this left hemisphere lighting up nicely. We move down here to what we call tonal memory non-analytic. That just simply means that somebody plays two notes and says, are these two notes the same or different? So you hear two notes, beep, beep, and you listen to them, and then you tell them same or different. Now, over here, you hear these two notes, and analytical means I want you to structure that. I want you to think of those two notes and put them in terms of a graph, or color them in words, or make pictures out of them, or whatever you want. And see, it's shifted over to the other hemisphere. So it's not that music is shifted here in the right hemisphere. It's the task orientation. So what you bring to it, what you bring to the world in a way, determines what part of your brain is going to be processing it. Another way to put it is that those people who are relative music duffers that sort of know what they like but don't know too much about why, here they are. But a skilled musician, this is where they process music. And as a person moves from the more duffer type thing up into the analytical, they shift hemispheres. So what we're seeing here is that the brain operates in such a way that it depends that what the individual knows, in other words, each brain being specific based on the experience, because no two people's experience obviously can ever be exactly the same. So they bring a totally unique brain to the situation, and according to how they approach it, you can get differences in the activation patterns of the brain. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, the split brain thing, which is well known to us, but I wanted to sort of put it in the context of what we've said earlier. This is separating the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, and then asking the person, this is the experimental apparatus looking through there at the experimental subject who is reaching with his hand for an object which he can't see because it's been occluded. And of course, he then can watch his eye to make sure he doesn't cheat and things like this. Now, what happens is that you find that if you take a chimeric figure, you take two pictures, this one, and you split them in half, and you put them up like that, it depends very much on how you go about eliciting the information as to what each half of the brain does. If you say, what did you see? The person says, I saw a man, dark eyebrows, and a mustache, because this is what came over to the left hemisphere, which of course is the language hemisphere in most of us that are right-handed, and also in about 85% of us that are left-handed. Whereas if you say, point to what you saw, they point to Catherine Deneuve. So it's very much a matter of how the thing is structured as to which part of the brain is being used. Now, to give you a feeling for how this works here, we'll look at this individual, and I'll give you two different pictures of him. Let's imagine we do a chimeric figure of the senator like that, and we put the right side of his face together. Oops, I go back again. And that's what we see. Now, suppose we do the left side and put them together. This is what they see. Now, most people find that this picture looks more like him than this picture. Yes or no? And the thought is that it's because the right side of his face is going into the right side of our brain, right? As you're sitting there, you're looking, left side is going into your right hemisphere, which has to do with visual recognition, facial recognition, and therefore when we look at this chimeric figure, we say, well, you know, not exactly, but yeah, looks like him. But then you look at this and you say, whoa, no. So this is the kind of thing that we're learning about the brain that we are not going to be able to get. You could turn the lights up a bit if we would. That we're not going to get a total explanation of the brain, because to talk about an explanation of the brain is itself paradoxical. That'd be fine. That'd be good. Also, one of the paradoxes is that we use our brain to understand the brain. Now, some people aren't put off by that. In the Scientific American issue on the brain several years ago, I think it was Weasel or David Thorson, it was Weasel, who said that he was not very much bothered by that because that's just the way things are. But we can't step outside of the frame. We're really talking about the frame problem. The idea of the little boy who stands up in front of the mirror, 3 years old, closes his eyes, and his mother says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I wanted to see what I look like when I'm asleep." The frame problem. It's the man who goes to the artist in the medieval times and wants him to do a picture of the studio. And he says, "But I want you to be in the studio. I want you to see you in the studio painting." So once we get into this infinite regress, because he's in the picture painting, and then there's a picture of him painting in the picture painting, and you don't get to the end of it. You can't step outside the frame. And is there some way that we can look at the brain in a totally objective way? Well, we can't use the brain, we can't think of the brain as an object, because it's the thing that we're using. I mean, it's us. We are the brain. It dictates, to a large extent, the way we perceive the reality around us, the way we create the reality. We didn't talk this evening about some of the experiments of Colin Blakemore and other people who show that you can take animals such as cats, you can raise them in environments in which they only see horizontal lines, and then the brain will become modified that it will not appreciate verticality, or vice versa. Or if they are raised in an environment which is only vertical lines, they won't appreciate the idea of horizontal world, so that the cat raised that way would keep bumping into this lectern because it hasn't had that experience. So that there's both the embedded, the imprinted, the little boy, the little baby sticking the tongue out, there's the imprinted, but there's also the learning. We also know about the effect of environment, stimulation. We know about food, the effect of malnutrition on the developing of the early brain. Now, as I said, my final interest is of course in brain transplants, and I'm always interested in people asking me about brain transplants, so that's why I had these slides. So I think I'm going to show you the ultimate brain transplant information and see what you make of it. I'll read it to you. This is a hospital room, and I want you to look carefully at the patient. And the doctor's saying, "I must apologize for Dr. Sykes. He got carried away, and well, he conducted a brain transplant." I'm not sure I know why I'm telling you this, because if you understand this, you're a very smart little doggy indeed. Listen, thank you very much, and I'd like to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Restak. The ushers are going to be coming and collecting cards again in the next few minutes, so please write your questions. We have a few to start. and some are related to your talk and others are not. Is it your understanding that dyslexia is neurologically based?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. If you look back on the history, even the Orton Society and early views about dyslexia, there was some hints that there was some physical process. We know that there's a high incidence of dyslexia among males as opposed to females, among left-handers, that there's also a lot of mixed dominance with people with dyslexia. It wasn't until we got BEAM, or brain electrical activity maps, or ways of looking at the function of the brains as it works, that we can see that the dyslexic brain actually does not use the same language and speech centers that the other brains do, that it's actually more distributed. There's some more frontal supplementary motor cortex and more distributed function than in a child who can read. This has a lot of important implications because you can diagnose this fairly early. You also can send them for one of these scans, also shows up on a PET scan, and when they're reading, you can actually see that they're using different parts of the brain than a person who doesn't have dyslexia. So it's certainly neurologically based, yes. Mm-hmm.
What part of the brain is engaged when a person is speaking spontaneously versus reading aloud versus reciting from memory?
Well, things overlearned, of course, are more embedded in the memory. As I'm speaking, it doesn't matter whether I'm reciting something or whether I'm speaking spontaneously. I'm still using the Broca's area and Wernicke's area and language centers. There's various differences in my retrieval memory. So the person means that would there be different parts of the brain involved if one were using, memorizing something or speaking spontaneously? Not so much different parts of the brain involved in the language production or in the language processing. However, its locking into the memory system would be different, and it's retrieval memory. In other words, the difference between retrieval memory and recognition memory, as we get older, our retrieval memory begins to slip. You say to somebody who's the 16th president of the United States, and they're thinking, and then you say, well, was it Washington, was it Herbert Hoover, was it Lincoln? They say, oh yeah, Lincoln. So the recognition memory remains, but the retrieval memory is not there. Now that's tied up, of course, with language. I think that's about as much as I can do with that question in terms of, unless they had something else in mind, I don't know.
Okay, continuing with memory issues.
Okay.
In a recent article in the Washington Post, you stated that, based upon what we know in regard to memory lapses, there is no reason to believe that President Reagan is not up to the job.
Well, that was a fun, no, I'm sorry.
There's more. What would you need to know, short of clear impairment, to draw the opposite conclusion, i.e. to advise the cabinet to remove him for neurological evidence?
Well, well, you know, when I came up here, the other thing that occurred to me was I was going to be speaking the same evening as State of the Union message, and I thought, oh boy, that's going to just, there's going to be nobody there, and somebody said, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I had the misfortune of talking at the Ford Hall in Boston the night of the third presidential debate, and that did cut into the audience a bit. I wrote this article in the Post at the request of looking into, is it neurologic reason for thinking there may be some impairment based on memory. So to answer the second part of the question first, before you would define senility, which of course is just simply a layman's term for dementia, you'd have to know about things like judgment, insight, control of emotions and impulses and things like this, flexibility, ability to change. These are all the components of dementia or senility, not just memory. Memory alters as we get older. All of us, if you do testing in terms of fast retrieval, it always decreases as one ages. Now, there are exceptions, but in general, you don't see too many older people on quiz shows and things like that. The wisdom of the age, however, has to do with the fact that the memory is more efficient. It's encoded in terms of recognition memory. Why do we have most of our Supreme Court justices older? I mean, if we're going to take the idea that the only really good and legitimate measure of a person's ability is their capacity to spill out information, then we're going to miss a lot of very important things about wisdom and about judgment. Think back to, Carter, for instance. He had a tremendous ability to come up with facts on command, whereas people like, JFK had this. Johnson was more vague in terms of that. Reagan is more vague. Not so much having this, and I think it's a facility that some people have or they don't. I don't think that in itself would enable you to make the kind of a judgment that I was, talking about in this article. So the whole point of the article was that, memory just isn't enough. A person who has the kind of memory deficit that would imply that they were demented would be the kind of person that not only do they don't remember what was talked about yesterday, but they don't remember they met you for the conversation. And all of these things, it's their impenetrable quality. They do not alter with experience. They cannot improve with coaching. A friend of mine, a neurologist, one time took patients with Alzheimer's, and he used one of these memory systems, like the Harry-Lorraine system. And what you can do in things like that is raise them up very slightly so that they tend to maybe get back into the normal range again. Of course, the reason that that's not really legitimate, if you use the same method with younger person, they do much better. The other thing you have to think about when you're testing memory or thinking about memory in an older person, that they have, with few exceptions, were never exposed in school to anything other than rote memory. These memory systems that we have, these mnemonic systems, although they can be traced back to the Greeks, and they were developed by the Greeks, they simply fell out of favor. It's only now that they're coming back. We hear so much about, well, you don't want to just memorize it, you want to learn it. Well, there's sort of a renaissance now of memorization. My daughters in their school, they come back and they have poems and they have things that they actually memorize. And then you can say to them after 4 or 5 weeks, well, how about the week before? And they can rattle off 20 or 30 minutes of poetry if you want to. So this is a sort of a renaissance of it. So when you're testing people who are older, they're not likely to have been taught a memory system. So I think in terms of Reagan or anybody else that one would look upon and question dementia or senility, it's not just memory, it's all these other things as well.
Okay. What is your opinion of cognitive psychology?
Well, the cognitive psychologists provided us with an alternative to the rats in the mazes and things like that. If we didn't have the renaissance of interest in consciousness and what we all know is going on inside our heads right now, the things that the internal processes, introspection. There was this interest in this with the introspectionists, Wundt and people like that, and then it fell out of favor with Skinner and Watson and all this, and just simply stopped looking at consciousness because this was the black box that you couldn't get into. Well, with the development of evoked potentials, as we saw, with the development of ways of probing the brain, so as a person, let me tell you about an interesting experiment that was done in Denmark. This has to do with the PET scan, where you're looking at the color-coded map of the brain activity, and you say to the person, squeeze your fist or raise your hand, and you see this area lighting up in the brain that corresponds to the hand area. And then you say to them, well, just think about moving your fist. Don't move it, just think about it. And you see this supplementary motor area lighting up. So therefore, you've actually got a PET scan of a thought, if you will. You've got an intention which I think is then put into or seen in a physical form. I think probably the greatest person of insights about the mind was William James. And I think you can go back now and read with great benefit his book, I think it was 1898, I think it was, the Psychology, because he sort of adumbrated this. He had hints that this kind of thing was going to come on. And of course, one was not able to do this until we had the technology. So the cognitive psychology was really something waiting for the technological background to come forth. You could say the same thing about Freud when you talk about the fact that there were not any ways then. The microscopic method of looking at the brain had sort of gone as far as it's going to go, staining and so forth. But what do? You try to count nerve cells. We've already said they don't all light up. So you look at some of them, they light up, some of them don't. So therefore you can't conclude, and counting cells doesn't tell you anything. More important than that, the most important element is the functional dissociation. So now you look at PET scans of schizophrenia and manic depression, and you see dynamic changes that take place. The problem is that it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to get that cyclotron produced product into the brain and then the processing, and you've got to measure this over a 30, 40-minute period. Well, you can't hold a thought for 40 minutes. You can listen to music, you can read, but you can't really hold a thought that time. So the idea of capturing a thought is probably not going to be realistic until there's some way of increasing the time so you get what we call this thing in real time. So you're actually capturing what's happening within somebody's head. So that's why cognitive psychology, I think it's such a renaissance, because we have this technological proof for it. Before, the only proof was, I think it was beetle in a box. It was, Wittgenstein talked about that one person's consciousness was like a beetle in a box. You have your box with your beetle in it, and I've got my box with my beetle, and he calls it the beetle in the box. We all know it's there, but you have to, how do you demonstrate it?
Perhaps this is a jump, but related. What happens to the brain during meditation? And is it possible that meditation could provide us with a different or even objective vantage point not available through the senses or through the brain itself? Perhaps from your idea about holding a thought.
Yeah, of course, that man now won that lawsuit against the Maharishi because he didn't learn to fly. Was that in the paper up here? Yeah, so that's not exactly an answer to the question, but obviously there are changes that can take place in meditative state. You go into alpha state, you can alter the EEG. Of course, the EEG is such a gross instrument. You're just picking up the surface sorts of processes. Yeah, there's all these many, many neurons that are going on. And one of the things that came up in the making of the brain and in the writing of the book was, how involved should we get on ESP and how involved should we get in meditative processes? I think that one of the things that can be a problem for neurobiology is to move into these areas too prematurely. I don't think we really know what's going on in these areas. And I think to try to neurologize methods of thought and religious views, the Eastern principally, that go back thousands of years, and try to do a reduction of them, what Huxley used to call nothing buttery. It's nothing but, this is nothing but, sex is nothing but, love is nothing but sex and things like this, and saying that these meditative techniques are nothing but something happening within the brain. There's still the translation, there's still the jump that has to be made between what you're seeing. It's the category mistake at Gilbert Ryle. You take the little boy to university and show him the Department of Music and show him the Department of History, and he meets the dean, and he meets the professor of theology, and then he's leaving and he wants to know where the university was. You have to say, well, the university is sort of the concatenation of all these various things. I think this is the category mistake that we can get into when we try to be too reductionist. Now, I realize I was pretty reductionist tonight. See, when you say the mind is nothing but the brain, that's essentially the message that I'm giving. Someone could say critically, well, wait a minute. You're really thinking that this brain is isolated from the rest of the body, but we know now that it's actually a brain endocrine system. So that maybe our idea of the brain is too limited. Maybe it's not just what's sitting inside our skull. Maybe it is that so interpenetrated with endocrines and with things floating around inside our blood and all these sorts of things that go back to medieval times, that we're too limited. Now, if we look upon that in a broader view of what brain is, then we're at that point able to get into, I think, what ESP is, what meditation is.
Is there a part of the brain controlling creativity?
There are PET scans on people that are creative people that show, as I mentioned about the music, that was one of the early ones, showing that the PET scan of the person who is musically sophisticated is different than the individual who is musically unsophisticated. There have been studies of mathematicians and chess players. Chase did an early study on chess players, which is very simple to do, actually. You can take a chess game in the middle of a right in the middle of a very complex game, and just have a chess master look at it for just a second, and he'll come back and he can recreate it. And you say, well, so what? No, sort of what you'd expect. But if you take the pieces and you just put them on in a haphazard way, he can't do it any quicker than the ordinary person can because it's in a position that's not meaningful. It's not an engram that he can relate to because these pieces are in situations they couldn't be. So we know that the brain of the chess player is operating in a very highly specialized, different way. So I think now that we have PET scans and things like this, we're going to be able to bring in, as we already are doing, highly creative people. At UCLA, they're getting volunteers in the music department, and they're the ones that are the most usually amenable to this in terms of coming in and looking at the changes that will be seen in their brain.
If someone has had severe left brain damage, as from a stroke, how do you explain improvement of speech that can happen with therapy?
Well, of course, the earlier it happens, the better. The other thing about the brain, we talk about holistic and localization. I didn't have time to go into the fact that, of course, the further back you go, the more holistic the brain is. You can take off the whole left hemisphere of a child 3 or 4 years of age and they grow up to be normal. So you just take the brain right away. We found that out. People with brain tumors have taken the whole hemisphere away. They essentially are someone with half a brain, if you want to put it that way, yet they grow up to be normal. Same thing happening in an adult would be catastrophic. And it's interesting how even doctors sometimes will forget this. I saw a young boy, 12 years of age, about 2 weeks ago, who has a brain tumor, a very slow-growing tumor, and he's had it since he was age 8. It's been growing 4 years, and he gets a CAT scan, and then he got an MRI, and then he got a PET scan, and it's constant putting off this operation. And as I said, it really did not make sense because the longer we wait, the more the brain becomes adult in its pattern, and the greater the loss is going to be. Whereas if the surgery is done early, he'd grow up to probably be very close to normal. So why are these changes? Now, in an adult, we have a stroke, left hemisphere, having to do with our right hand, use of our right hand. It's very hard to recover because the brain loses its plasticity, becomes more localized, more specialized. When you go to build a house, you want people that are plumbers and electricians and things like that. You don't want just people that can sort of do a little bit of everything. Those houses don't quite go together very well. Same thing with the brain. It becomes more specialized because parts of it take on particular patterns, particular ways that they do things. But getting back again to our earlier comments, you have to be very careful about localizing this because to infer localization from deficit is always a very tricky business.
There's people who are still interested in Reagan. Is loss of memory with aging caused by physical degeneration of brain cells? And second question is, does the brain or its parts wear out with age? And are we fated to cognitive failure at the age of 100?
Well, we all can think of people whose abilities continued well into older age, so that it's not absolute, but it does follow that our cognitive abilities tend to decline along with everything else. So it would follow, if you think about the brain as being a physical organ, why would it be any different? So that the abilities and certain things like mathematics and physics and things like that, you're an old man when you're 40. Chess, things like this. I mean, the great preeminent creative people are people that are very young. But then, as I say, you get into things like jurisprudence, if you consider that a science, and they have abilities that continue into old age. We look at some of the people who, Winston Churchill and others like this, that continued. The actual brain cells are lost. Yeah, there's loss of brain cells. You can see that on CAT scans. You get ventricles get bigger. You get greater spacing between the sulci of the hemispheres. So you get smaller brain as one gets older. If you live long enough, I guess you would have to say that you would be probably tending towards dementia as one gets. Although, having said that, it's also important to mention that 95% of all Americans who reach the age of 67 years of age will be of normal mentation. So there's a little bit of Alzheimer's anxiety out there. Everybody has this fear. Of course, getting back to memory, I think it's because people are constantly testing their memory. And memory is a little bit like the sleep thing. In other words, if you have to go to sleep for something important, you have an important meeting the next day, and you say, boy, I've got to get to sleep. I've got to get to sleep. Well, you're not going to get to sleep. And if something is so important to remember that you've got to remember it, you don't do well. We all remember that from our experiences and examinations. A certain degree of anxiety is good, but when it gets to a certain point, it becomes immobilizing and paralyzing. I think that's when people begin to fear that their memory's going, then they can find all kinds of reasons that they're not remembering things. Particularly interesting when you see people like I do who have minor head injuries. They may slip on some ice and hit their head and they're just dazed for a few seconds, but then they're okay. Then they come in a few weeks later and they can't remember this and they can't remember that, and you often get them made in and you find out, well, that's sort of the way they were. But you also can be fooled in terms of missing dementias, because I had a patient who came in who was, I thought he was not doing too well, and we tested him, but I didn't know what he was like before. And then I thought, well, I really missed the boat on this, because I found out that he had gone from second or third vice president up to second or first vice president of this bank where he was working. He had been given this very definite promotion. So I thought, well, gosh, this fellow wouldn't have gotten this promotion. But then I found out from the one at the bank that, he was moved from a very, very important area where he gave out a lot of money to one where he sort of sat in his office. So he was losing his ability. So yes, we do lose neurons as we go. There's 15 billion, at least, maybe 100 billion if you want to count some of these little cells we saw up there and call them information processors, because now we think of the glial cells in the brain as also information processors. So they're not just sort of sitting there like a struts for a light show. So we have a lot of redundancy in the brain. We have a lot of ability to lose many, many cells. People say, well, is it true every time you have a glass of alcohol you lose 100,000 neurons or something? I mean, that sounds kind of puritanical stuff. I mean, I don't know where anybody would get this, because where would you count them and where would you find them? But even were it true, I mean, you've got a lot of neurons that you can lose before it really took a toll. Now, having said that, of course, the thing about the fetal alcohol syndrome most definitely shows that alcohol in the fetus is very harmful, and that's why I predict that you'll see on the East Coast, as we've seen on the West Coast, a lot of signs in bars and things telling women, if they're pregnant, to be very careful about drinking, because we now know that the most harmful effects of alcohol are in the first trimester, specifically the first 6 or 7 weeks, and it's not at all unusual, for a woman to not know she's pregnant till she's 6 or 7 weeks into this. So.
It's funny that this came out, because the question I was just going to ask is true or false. 1 ounce of whiskey destroys 8,000 brain cells. So the numbers are all over the place.
The numbers are all over the place, yeah.
There are several questions relating to dreaming and sleeping, and I'll try and put them together. One question asks is, when you're asleep, is your brain not in use? And do you actually dream using your brain? And following that is, does it make sense to analyze dreams?
Well, first of all, the idea that the brain is less active in the dream or sleep state is simply not true. I mean, that was the easiest thing to come upon. Well, we sleep because we need rest. Because, if we were out working a hard day, we want to sit down and watch TV, then we feel better, we want to read a book because we need rest. Therefore, the brain must be the same way and it rests. Actually, it's even more active. Certain parts of the brain are even more active in the sleep stage. So we think that probably what's happening is that certain things are rehearsed in the sleep and dream stage. This is why certain animals and things that have cats and dogs that have a lot of dream states, we think that they're actually rehearsing sorts of behaviors. And you can sort of prove this by doing sections in the brainstem that release the animal. We're inhibited when we're asleep. That's why we don't, if we have somebody chasing us, the only reason we don't get up and run is because there are these inhibitory fibers that go down and literally paralyze us. And we are paralyzed. Now, you can cut those fibers in a cat, and when they go into REM sleep or dream sleep, they'll run up and snarl or chase something as if it's right there. So we sort of figure same thing is happening in our own dream state. Something's being rehearsed. Of course, it gets interesting when you say, then why do real tiny infants, fetuses, real small babies, why do they spend most of their time in the REM sleep? Are they thinking about what things were like back there? I mean, I don't know. It's sort of, but there is some rehearsal thing. Is it possible that the infant is rehearsing not scenarios, not behavioral scenarios, but functional scenarios, breathing patterns, movement patterns, things like this? Is this sort of like being rehearsed? Now, the last part of it about the meaningfulness of dreams, I mean, I think it varies. I mean, we do impose a meaning on some of them, but there's obvious dreams that have had meanings. There are dreams that predict things are going to happen. There are dreams that are experiential. I think the most exciting thing about dreams is the experiential part, where you actually have an experience with the intensity that you had when you were actually there. And you can't produce that by thinking about it. And you can sit here now and you can think back to what it was like in college, and you can think back to your roommate and your professor and all that. But you could have a dream tonight that would bring you back there, that you could wake up, you could be tearful, you could be happy, you could be despondent. I mean, for that short intensity. And of course, we think of this in highly limbically related because of Penfield's work in which you could stimulate. His paper was called Experiential Illusions. So people were guilty, if you would think of it as mental diplopia. They were lying on the operating table, knowing they were in the operating table, and yet reporting very clear experiences that they had when they were years earlier. A patient of mine had a temporal lobe epileptic, would describe various things, and then he would call his sister, who lived out in Kansas City, and he would ask her to go and check various things which he had. So these were not in the sleep stage, these were when he was awake, but they had a dream-like quality to them because they were associated with his seizures. I'm rereading The Idiot now, and of course Prince Mishkin in there is temporal lobe epileptic, and there is a good example of the interpenetration of sleep and dreaming. There's certain times he's not aware of whether he's in a dream state or whether he's having something happen. There are various scenes in there where he's not sure whether this person is actually encountering them or whether he in fact is having a dream about them.
What is a brainwave? And there's a comment saying, please keep this in simple terms. Describe brainwaves as fruits or articles of clothing.
Well, Lord Adrian discovered, or the first one that discovered the existence of electroencephalogram was considered sort of an unusual, and I guess they thought of him as a little bit wacky because he spent his time in the evening putting electrodes onto people, and he was thought that he could demonstrate that there was indeed these brainwaves. For the life of me, I'm blocking his name. I can't think of it offhand. If anybody remembers it, just shout it out. Now, of course, that wasn't sufficient. Lord Adrian then you have to get Lord somebody. He comes in, he says, yes, that's such. And they put the electrodes on and measure the cortical, the measurements of the actual electrical activity. So this was the proof, of course, that the brain is electrically active, but you're only sampling a small amount. So the electroencephalogram, when somebody goes in and gets an EEG, I mean, it's like just looking at the ripples of water on an ocean. I mean, there's all this that's going on down below. So you can get to that with cortical electrodes, putting them down in, and this is how it can be done in surgery, and that's what Penfield did. I described that in The Brain, the Last Frontier, where he actually goes in and stimulates areas that you wouldn't be able to get to. The most exciting thing, of course, is the evoked potentials, which we showed a slide of. That's a specific way of probing electrically into the brain and sampling particular responses. For instance, we mentioned a moment ago about standing at the ocean. If I'm standing at a pond and I throw a little stone in there, you can see the ripples that go, and you can follow those ripples. If I do the same thing at the ocean, you can't follow it because of the background. Same thing if you put in a flashing light or a sound into the ear, you can use computers to average out the background. It's like averaging out the ocean waves, and then you can just see the effect of this particular input, whether it's visual or auditory. This is the evoked potential. It enables you to measure what's happening in that particular brain. So this is so-called brain wave. I mean, this is the brain wave testing.
This will be the last question. Is there any truth in the cliche that we use only a small part of our brain capacity?
Well, my favorite answer to that is some of us use very little. That's very little indeed. Nobody knows how much of the brain capacity we use because how would you be able to test it? You can start to use pentothal and see how long it is before somebody begins to lose their capacity to remember or to count or subtract or things like that. Or you can study patients who've had brain surgery and lost large portions of their brain. But, what do you use as the standard? I mean, we suspect, because there's so many of these neurons, that we're not using all of them, but it is conceivable that every neuron in the brain is connected with every other one by no more than one or two connections. So each one of them has 1,000 synaptic connections with another, and it may not be more than two orders of connection removed from every other one in there. So when you get to that kind of an intermix, that kind of complexity, you really get to something that's even beyond the number of particles in the universe as we know them, so that you really can't even begin to imagine this kind of complexity. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. You're a very attentive audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.